Hello everybody, I'm Dara Keogh and I'm proud to be President of DCU and delighted to welcome you here tonight to this Dublin Book Festival event. It's a busy night here in the Students' Union building at the end of a busy day and the start of Halloween celebrations, but it's wonderful to have everybody here. Just housekeeping notices before we begin. You can see where the exits are, and remember that it is Halloween, so masks on throughout and phones off. So that's our message. So please follow the guidelines. I'm delighted and really proud to welcome back to the University tonight DCU alumnus Richard Chambers for the launch of his exceptional book, A State of Emergency, the story of Ireland's COVID crisis. I'm also delighted to welcome Sarah McInerney, another distinguished alumna of Dublin City University's School of Communications. I'm a historian, but they say that journalism is the first rough draft of history. And I know that this volume that we celebrate tonight and that we interrogate will be hugely valuable resources to not just to the readers, but to historians and researchers in the future. First and foremost, the volume is a compelling read. It contains testimony from the key players, including the decision makers and government and the HSE and all those who are directly affected by the tragedy of COVID. In that sense, it's not just telling us what the pandemic was like, but what the crisis felt like for people going through it. The title, of course, has allusions and echoes of the emergency, Ireland's Second World War experience. And for many of us, and for you and people watching the broadcast, that the pandemic felt like a war, a series of battles against an unpredictable and invisible enemy. And during the pandemic, journalists like Richard were themselves at the front and frontline workers and commentators on the events. Indeed, the value of dedicated journalists and quality journalism has been highlighted throughout the pandemic, providing the public with clear and timely information and updates to the public, but more than that, providing a critical voice where necessary in society. It's a point of great pride to many of us at the university, and I can hear the head of the School of Journalism purring at the back of the room here, that many of the journalists who led the commentary and reportage throughout the pandemic were themselves graduates of Dublin City University. We are proud that our School of Communication is ranked #1 in Ireland and in the top 150 schools in the world. What makes us proudest is that graduates like Richard and Sarah are leaders in their field. They are exemplars of the mission of our university to transform lives and societies, and more than that, they are models to our students and an inspiration to prospective students. It gives me great pleasure now to give way and to exit right to the main event. So congratulations, Richard, on the book, and well done to everyone involved in this wonderful publication. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. That was quite an introduction. As Dara said, my name is Sarah McInerney. I'm a broadcaster with the RTE, and I'm delighted to be here this evening. I was delighted to be asked to officially launch the book, and then I was even more delighted when I read it because it's really good, and I love to be associated with things that are really good. It sort of makes me feel good by association. So here I am, unabashedly associating myself with Richard, even though I had nothing to do with the book at all. My job normally this evening would be to talk about Richard as an author and Richard as a broadcaster and Richard as a person and how great he is. But I was thinking about it over the last couple of days and I thought I don't need to do any of those things really, because I think everybody knows what a good journalist Richard is because you've seen it yourselves over the last 2 years. He's been on your screens every night explaining what's going on with the pandemic, so I don't need to tell you that. I mean, I have some personal experience with it because of course, we broadcast together, didn't we?
Yeah.
We were co-presenting News Talk Drive on quite a few occasions. You were my broadcast husband. So I have personal experience with it, but you also have personal experience with Richard every night, so I don't need to tell you about that. And in terms of what a nice person he is, I mean, like honestly, only a nice person would spend hours trawling through Twitter answering questions of people as to whether they can get into Coppers, wouldn't they, you know, for like without booking a ticket or not, or is it €8 or €9 for a substantial meal? Like, this is a nice guy. Like, his credentials are right out there. One thing I will say, however, is having read the book, the one thing that really occurred to me throughout it, like on a number of different occasions, was I worked in print as well. I worked in the Sunday Times and the Sunday Tribune, and I know what it's like and how difficult it can be to get people to speak honestly to you, either on or off the record, particularly when it's a subject that can be quite politically delicate. And certainly the pandemic is politically delicate. It still is. And it was throughout the time that Richard was conducting his interviews. And yet he managed to get household names, like we're going to discuss it in a second, but household names, people that we're all familiar with, to speak really frankly, openly, honestly, both on and off the record, about their own personal experiences of the pandemic and also their experiences with colleagues. You know, some of the stuff is really sort of jaw-dropping that people have said to him. And what occurred to me while I was reading it is that is a measure of the journalist that he is, because only people would only speak to him like that if they really trusted him. That's a really good journalist. If they trusted that they could speak that openly and frankly to him and trust that he would treat the information fairly and in a balanced way and not misrepresent them in any way. So for me, like, I don't need to say anything more about Richard. If you read the book, you'll see the evidence of what he's managed to do here. So with that said, we're going to discuss the book, and it is great. So we're going to spend about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, something like that, going through all the juicy details. And then we have about 10 or 15 minutes at the end. We'll have questions for people who are here in the room. And I know there's also quite a few people watching online. So we have a way, I think there's a chat system online if you're watching. You can put in your questions. And I have my iPhone here. That's the technology we're using. And I'll be able to see your messages coming through as well. So we'll get to as many of your questions as we possibly can this evening, okay? So I'm going to start off with when you decided to write the book, because I was speaking to Michel Barnier recently, name drop. And
That's a clang.
thank you. And he said that he decided to write his Brexit book as soon as he was appointed a Brexit negotiator. He started keeping diaries with a view to writing the book. So when you got into the pandemic and saw that you were going to be like in the middle of it, did you think book?
No.
Okay.
I didn't think about a book at all. I had half of an idea that maybe it would make a good book. But it was only at the start of this year, actually, when Harper Collins, Conor Nagel sort of got in touch with me and said, hey, do you want to write a book about all this? You seem to have done a lot on it. And I was like, I think I could do it. I think it was important to just have a go. Doing it in the moment was really, really important to me, that it wouldn't be this look back in years down the line when the memories have sort of gone a little bit foggy. You sort of have this little bit of, were they really that bad? Yeah. You know, when you're in the room together, all these people will start to sort of, compartmentalize all the frustrations they had at the time, and they'll try and brush past them. It'll be very sort of sanitized. I was like, this is a chance now to really sort of crack open the lid of what Nphet is, what the Cabinet Subcommittee on COVID is, what happened in our hospitals, in our public health departments, in places right around the country. So I thought, I've had an opportunity through Virgin Media to do both the political side, the Nphet and the HSE side, and the Frontline element. So I thought, okay, I could probably give this a go. And yeah, it's been a bit of a whirlwind ever since. A lot of early nights, or early mornings, not late nights, late nights as well, just sort of trying to piece it together and get interviews sort of set up and really make a go of it. And we turned it around fairly quickly in the end.
You certainly did. And we might go back to the beginning, which is the beginning of the book, but it's also the beginning of the pandemic. And it was the election. You see, this is the thing, because when the book landed on my desk, I thought, I sort of know all this. I was there, I lived through it. And then I started reading and I was like, oh, I forgot about that. And oh yeah, and I did. And then there was all the stuff that I never knew. But one of the things that really struck me, rereading it or reading it and re-remembering it, was how the election sort of meant we all took our eye off the ball, didn't we? Like,
there was very little. I think it's important that the media can be self-critical on this. I don't think there was any real focus on coronavirus until it was already a big issue elsewhere in the world. I remember, it's in the book as well, one of the first nights we ever thought to even ask a politician about it was after the election. It was when Leo was facing the Parliamentary Party after Fine Gael had an absolute hammering at the election, and I can't remember who it was. For life of me, I can't remember who it was. It's probably best I don't mention it anyway. But we all thought, will we ask Leo about this coronavirus? And there was just a little ripple of laughter, and I was like, here, come on, we're not asking about that. And that's really where it sort of started. Everybody, whether it was in the media, in politics as well, did not understand what was coming. There were a number of key people in this country who did, and who were very worried early on. A lot of people in science, Maura Connolly in particular, actually based out of NUI Galway, an incredibly eminent person in the field of developing infections and diseases. She knew that this was going to be horrific. The Christmas decorations were still up in her house when she was thinking this is going to be something we live with. People like Tony Holohan as well was sort of organising chats at that point. But across politics and media and generally, I think we only really figured out that this was something that was really worrying too late. I actually remember the first day I really felt that this was something was the day. Do you remember Simon Harris cancelled the rugby match on the 6-1 news?
All? Yeah.
And everyone in politics threw their hands up in the air and it's like, what is happening here? Who are these shroud wavers and what do they want with our rugby? That day when the IRFU then came to the Department of Health for the showdown talks about it, I remember speaking to a couple of people in the Department of Health then that day, and they're like, no, this isn't the flu. This is something which is probably going to be with us for a long, long time. I suppose that raises the question as well why we thought initially in politics this is going to be a 2-week lockdown. This will be a month-long lockdown.
Well, I mean, I think there's a quote in there somewhere in there about Leo talking about we'll have to do this for a couple of weeks. I can't remember what it was, but it was, and you actually say weeks. I mean, nobody realised. But on that, actually, Simon Harris and taking the initiative, really, didn't he, when it came to the rugby match, and some of his friends, or colleagues rather, weren't that impressed, and you go through that. But also really interesting is from the outset, Tony Holohan and Simon Harris, Tony Holohan laid down a marker.
Yeah.
Nphet is Nphet, and you guys are separate, because Simon Harris is trying to piggyback a little bit on one of the Nphet briefings. Can you tell us a bit about that?
So it's really interesting. Like, everybody is so familiar with the idea of Nphet at this point as this, this body that we see at these pristine press conferences all the time. There's been previous Nphets for different things like various respiratory conditions and whatnot, but they set up in the political vacuum when the election was happening. So nobody in politics could stop them doing what they're doing. The Department of Health is effectively running on autopilot. Tony Holohan gets a few of his mates, a few of his advisors, people he knows and trusts around the table to say, here, what are we going to do about this? So it was only very late in the game. The politicians, by the time they'd come back from the election, Nphet was already up and running. And it is quite a different setup to how we've seen it in other countries, where it has been very much, you'd probably see Boris Johnson alongside his CMO all the time, whereas here it was very CMO and medical focused. There was an initial Nphet meeting where Simon Harris and his media advisor wanted to come into the room basically to try and introduce them to the public so people weren't scared. It's like, who are these medics? What are they doing with their lives? But he wanted to sit in on the meeting, and it was very much a marker was laid down early on. I remember that day because myself and one of my camera colleagues from Virgin Media were up there to take shots of Simon Harris is going to meet up with all these experts. He's going to do this thing. I remember distinctly that day, Tony Holohan pulled him over into the corner, and he pulled over the media advisor as well. And effectively what was happening there was he was laying down a marker. It's like, look, either you're here or I'm here, but we're not both here at the same time. He felt that if Nphet was actually going to ever work, you couldn't have Simon Harris or Leo Varadkar or Stephen Donnelly in time to come sitting in on the meetings, because people want to impress the minister or they might hold something back. Doctors, when they're sitting around a table themselves, they're very, very frank.
Yeah.
They swear a lot as well, as you'll see in the book. But
so does everybody.
So I think it was really interesting that there was an idea early on that they wanted to be very separate from the government. They would advise the government and help them out, but they didn't want to be seen as politically motivated or something that could be twisted to whatever the political directives would be of the government at the time, especially because it was a caretaker government, because they knew they might have another government coming in as well.
Yeah. And then another thing that really struck me was, as you say, these were people we didn't know. Tony Holohan, we would have sort of, in journalism, we'd sort of know him, and the public would probably be vaguely aware of him, but he wasn't like the figure that he is now. And we certainly didn't know Ronan Glynn, the deputy CMO, or some of the other figures that we've come to know now. And you go through the sort of the communications crash course some of these people had to take then, because is it Ronan Glynn you were talking about with the green marker and the whiteboard?
The stick mandate.
Like, my heart just, when I read it, I wasn't there, but I felt I was there. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
It really needs to be stressed that these briefings, do you remember the Nphet briefings at the start when they used to come out and they sit at the table and they used to tell us what was happening? At the start there was a real fear. Everybody around the country was afraid. The journalists in the room were afraid of what was happening. I remember they used to not even tell you what time the briefing would be on. You'd arrive at the Department of Health and you'd wait around for an hour and a half and there might be word that they're coming down from upstairs. But they needed to explain what contacts of contacts were. So we know what a close contact is, but they needed to explain to people when the early case were coming in, well, if you're a close contact of that close contact, we're not worrying about you yet. So they needed a way of explaining that. So they had their Nphet meeting, it was all very crunch talks, and Ronan Glynn pipes up and says, maybe I could do a diagram. So he came down, and this was such a great idea at the time. Tony Hoolan was like, this is going to be great. You're going to explain this, we're going to nail this is going to be visual communications. They wheel out this horrible whiteboard, and they tell us journalists, there's going to be a presentation here. And I'm like, this is going to be great. We're going to understand things. This is visual learning. This is the best way of learning. He proceeds to draw the wonkiest, skinniest stick man of all time with this horrible dry green marker. And he knew as soon, because we were all sitting in the front row, we have our cameras out, ready to tweet this excellent piece of communications to the public. And we just see the stick man appearing on the board behind. And as soon as he turned around, he knew, just by us, this shit's going viral, like, you know. And he still speaks about it now as probably the most mortified he's been in it. Oh. But it's like, when you think about it, the amount of things which had to be explained to people so quickly, which are so out of all of our wheelhouses. Like, I remember one day I was asked on the 5:30 news on Virgin Media to explain what the R number was. And I was like, right, who will I ring? And I was like, one person I knew in the HSE was like, have you seen the film Contagion? And I was like, I have seen it. I saw it recently, actually, yeah. So it was basically just, that's the level of, here's how you explain stuff. Watch Matt Damon get infected in a Hollywood film. That's where we're at.
So then, meanwhile, like, as the authorities are sort of grappling with it, as you have described very vividly there, on the ground things are getting bad. Obviously, you know, we have cases now. You know, when you describe how Ciaran de Gascon is really concerned about the cases coming through. But also, Karina Sadlier, I thought this was a really interesting episode. UCC or UCHG or however the hospital in Cork. I remember very vividly hearing that there was an outbreak in Cork, but I didn't know how we learned about that. And it was really Karina pushing it against protocol as well.
Yeah,
Tell us a little bit about
there's
that.
so much in the course of the pandemic where medics have had to take their own initiative because there's such strict protocols for when, at the start, when there was such a limit on how many swabs we had available. We had no testing, reagent. There was that whole debate in the Dáil about where can we get more reagent from. When you don't have enough stuff to do what you need to do, you limit it and you put in protocols. You only get them if they have flu symptoms and they've come from China or Italy or another affected area.
Yeah, because if we remember, and again from reading the book, like at the beginning, people were only being asked to isolate or get tested or whatever if, as you say, if they'd returned from China.
Cheltenham,
you know,
for example, happened. Everybody came back from Cheltenham. Yeah. There was an outbreak of cases here as a result of that. Nobody, unless you had symptoms coming back from Cheltenham, was asked to do anything. It was mad. It's mad at the time, and people do look back at that in high places and think, we were so slow on some of this stuff. And it's actually interesting because at the time, some of the politicians were actually pushing the hardest for restrictions, whereas Nphet and the HSE were like, here, don't go too far too soon.
Yeah.
But the instinct of different doctors...
Sorry, I interrupted you.
Because on the Karina Sadlier thing that you're talking about, in CUH, there was a guy who was effectively on... he was a farmer. He was in his 50s, I think. And he was showing really sort of signs of pneumonia. And he couldn't shift them at all. And they were just like, there's something different about this. And he'd been around the hospital. He'd been on a trolley in the emergency department. And there was Karina Sadlier says, I'm going to refer him for a COVID test. And she had to break protocol to do that. By the time he was discovered as having positive, this was the first case of what we know now as community transmission. We don't know where he got it from.
Which was why she had trouble, because he hadn't returned from China.
He hadn't been to China, he hadn't been anywhere. He had just been in Cork, effectively. And he had coronavirus, and it was like, oh my God, where is this? In the course of the hospital, this man has been around. He has had dozens of casual contacts between staff, other patients. It's like, okay, this has changed the game entirely. I'll remember that evening, actually, for the rest of my life. I remember there was, actually my colleague Zara King is here. Some of her she was in contact with other medics as well in CUH. There was a real sort of sense of, oh my God, we're facing an Italy situation here.
Yeah, it was just
because
the panic.
So many staff members went immediately into isolation. There was a real sense. I had people who were onto me, basically warning me to tell my partner Louise and her family in Cork here, get your shopping in. Myself and Zara went down to Tesco up in Clare, or not up around in Blanchardstown to load up on toilet roll, just because we were told this was going to be the thing. This was the trigger moment. Right. Effectively, it was a sign that things were going badly wrong, and it all sort of fell into place after that. But there was this real sense of fear. But it just shows, again, the initiative to break through what was the official stance on things was really, really important.
And then, as you say, it was the beginning of things getting really bad. And you describe in really good detail the different characters during that Nphet meeting where they decide on the first closures, the schools and tourism sites and things like that. And of course, Leo was away. And Simon Coveney was in charge. There's some quote where Leo seems to be sort of suggesting, I'll leave you in charge for a couple of days and this is what happens. But can you just describe to us a little bit about how different people felt? Because you describe it really vividly in the book. Just tell us a little bit about it.
It was chaos. Like this effectively happened after one of the Nphet press briefings that Tony Houlihan, Ronan Glynn and Cillian de Gaskin, who does the lab stuff, they all went upstairs after the press briefing. I think that was pretty good. And Cillian's phone bleeped with the latest results from the labs. And effectively, we'd seen our case count double in the space of a day. And there was literally, oh shit. And they're like, what's this about? Like, we've literally have this many positives now coming through the labs tomorrow. And the way it's described to me is that faces went completely ashen. And it's like, okay, we didn't think we'd have to do this for a while, but we're going to have to emergency Nphet meeting, and we're going to have to call in the government on this. This is going to result in restrictions. And what happened then was pure panic and chaos. Nobody in government says it's ideal that Leo Varadkar happened to be going over to meet Donald Trump at the time. So basically, they just called. Simon Harris was back in his kitchen in Greystones at the time. He was called back in. Simon Coveney was called in from his apartment in town. And basically, there was just this chaotic scene where there's civil servants running around getting Chinese from across the road in to try and feed these people who are coming in from across the country, actually, because they weren't really even doing a whole sort of Zoom thing at the time. But basically, it's a night that nobody will ever forget, because they were there until the hours of the morning, sort of pouring through, well, what do we do to stop this? Do we close the schools for a couple of weeks? That could do it. We could stop having It's actually so interesting, because we were facing at the start of it, and they were talking about how to have safe mass gatherings. And I was like, well, if you're having a couple of hundred people inside at a gig, that's fine. But it just shows that the understanding just has changed entirely from when it was at the start. But it's a night nobody will ever forget. There was this sort of sense of mania while all the politicians, so Harris and Coveney and Paul Reid of the HSE were sitting in a boardroom, sort of twiddling their thumbs, waiting for Nphet to come back with the sheet of paper with the recommendations, and they were sort of eating Maltesers, and Simon Coveney was telling boring war stories about, I remember this when we were doing Brexit and we did this, and it was sort of a doolally sort of situation for them. But then Tony Houlihan effectively walked into the room and was like, right, this is what we're going to have to do. And it's very interesting because it sort of set a precedent that Nphet effectively put it to the government, this is what you have to do. The government at that time, Simon Harris, the civil servants, Liz Canavan from the Department of the Taoiseach, as well as Simon Coveney, were like, okay, no question marks from here. Right. We better ring Leo and and get something on the way for this. Yeah. Okay. So it was a chaotic situation,
and then of course there was the PPE, because the whole world was in the same situation. And this was really new for me. And you have different characters in the book that, most of them I would be very familiar with. I wasn't familiar with Sean Bresnan, who's head of procurement in the HSE, and the things that he had to do to try and get the PPE, like Googling Happy St. Patrick's Day for the Chinese, in Chinese, to say to the Chinese, to try to convince the Chinese to give us PPE. It was really amazing, but we went very, very close to not having it.
There's one moment when I was interviewing Sean Bresnan, who is the head of procurement, as I say, for the HSE for the book, that stuck out to me. And it was one of the few moments, well, not few moments, but it was one of the moments where the hair on the back of my neck stood up when he was talking about when we were stuck for PPE, and we were waiting for some planes to come back from China, and we were effectively down to the bare bones. He was drafting up memos to send out to hospitals that, right, half everything you're using, your gowns, your masks, your goggles, ration that, we're cutting that to half, we've nothing left coming in. The HSE had to go out to Dublin Airport, stand at the side of the runway and hope a plane landed from China. And effectively, we need this as soon as this is off the plane to get this out to the Mater, to Vincent's, down to CUH, across the country. it was described to me as a Dunkirk moment, that this was the enemy is at the gates, we have no tools to fight it back. In the Mater Hospital, where we have a big focus in the book, they were down to a day. They were 1 day from running out of all of their PPE.
And like, what happens then? You know, I mean, they're just completely
Then
exposed.
if you're done, you end up in the London situation or the New York situation where you see medics taping bin bags to each other and strapping up. We were very, very close to a different situation entirely in this country. I think that's something which is going to be a focus when people come around asking questions about how this was all handled. We were very close. But the PPE war, as it's described to me, was one of the things which some people in the HSE did very well on. You talked about him sort of getting onto the Chinese and sort of pulling a few strings. They had the ambassador from China to Dublin is a man, his ambassador, who is his name? And Paul Reid and Sean Bresnan, they used to be referred to by the ambassador as Dr. Reid and Dr. Bresnan because he thought they work for the health service, they must be doctors. So they used to call him Doctor Who back because name was Who. So they all kind of laugh at that, a much needed laugh at the time. But it was really an exercise in we are going to plumoss the Chinese government as much as we can. We're going to use the idea out there to make sure we get it. And just really any sort of link we had. Bono as well was drafted in at one point to sort of
whatever you need to do.
What have we got? Can you help us out in any way? An extraordinary situation, and it really was just, we just need stuff in. Can anybody help us?
And you also make the point that once PAC gets a look at the procurement practices that went on, PAC might not be too happy, but that's a whole other issue. Then people are getting very sick, and you have a really difficult to read but really important section in the book about people getting really sick and the ICU nurse who ends up in her own ICU, and the panic around all of that and the difficulty. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so there's a focus on our healthcare workers in the book throughout it. I think they were the most important people I wanted to interview. I sort of, if you leave aside all of the government stuff, I wanted as clear a picture, as true a picture of the experience of our healthcare workers in it. Our healthcare workers were very much, particularly in the first and third waves, were very much in the line of danger on this. A lot of nurses in particular in emergency departments in ICU became very, very sick throughout this. And so ICU nurses were admitted to ICU with COVID-19. They're being treated by the same people they would have trained to do the job. Because ICU is super specialised. You spend years training to be able to be an intensivist or to be an ICU nurse. It's an incredible specialised thing. These people are family. It's like treating your own family member on the table in front of you is what it was. All of the staff in the Mater who had that experience of having to treat one of their own, it's just hugely traumatic. Yeah. And there's also a situation, of course, some of you might remember the case of Dr. Syed Wakar Ali. He was a locum emergency department doctor. He was working in the Mater Hospital at the time. He went down with COVID-19 and he was in ICU for a very long time, and he subsequently passed away. He was one of the first healthcare workers in the country to die of this, and there was a huge outpouring at the time. His story is one I really wanted to tell, particularly because his daughter, Dr. Summer Ali, who of course then graduated as a doctor herself and is now working in the Mater Hospital herself, I found her story just so extraordinary. She's just the most strong person I came across over the course of the book, out of just so many incredible people, just experiencing the trauma of basically now she works the floor above the ICU where her own father died. She every day has to get in that same lift where she was in when she was visiting her father. Every day it just gets that little bit easier, but it's just, I'm extraordinarily blown away by the strength of these people. It's just incredible.
No, it really comes across in the book. So you have that going on, and the reality of what's happening on the ground, which is so difficult. And then you have the HSE and the Department of Health and Tony Holohan and Paul Reid. My goodness.
It's described to me as two alpha males marking their patch, which is kind of a visual image I didn't really want to see. But these two guys were very much the rulers of their own domain. And the idea that the CMO was taking this father of the pandemic lead and setting the agenda for the HSE to follow was a tough one to swallow, I think, for the HSE and for Paul Reid in particular. They grated against each other a lot. That famously blew up into the public eye about, they set this testing target. How Tony Holohan set this, we're going to do 100,000 tests. And the HSE was like, we have no idea how we're going to do that. So thanks for doing that at the press conference. So behind the scenes, a lot of bad blood at times between the HSE and Nphet, which I don't think a lot of people know about. There is a view amongst very senior people on Nphet that the HSE, from the outset, misunderstood the virus, that they were focused on getting the defence forces in, organising morgues and organising, ships in and all that sort of stuff, when they could have been working on, let's boost our testing, let's give our public health teams regionally more resources, let's try and sort of figure out what's happening, because everybody remembers at the start we were looking for data. Where are the cases? How is it spreading? Where is it spreading? And all we were told was private house. That's not data that's good enough. Huge frustration in Nphet at the amount of the IT capabilities of the HSE as well. There's a lot of crosswords exchanged, and I think it all sort of boiled over to a point when in October and November, when we were looking at the Christmas recommendations, and we went to level 5 in October, where Paul Reid is presenting to the government saying...
I'm going to stop you because I want to get onto that in a minute. I just had a couple of passages in relation to Paul Reid and Tony Hoolan, because honestly, you see, what really struck me about this is they're still there, very much still there, and
kind
still,
of awkward, I'd say,
awkward, but also it's a bit, I won't say concerning, but it's certainly interesting to know that there's a very difficult relationship between two very important men in two very important positions when we're still in the pandemic and we're still making difficult decisions. But just a bit here worth reading. One person with knowledge of the back and forth, this is between the two men, said that at a Crunch Nphet meeting, the HSE delegates could go in and get the shit kicked out of them by Tony, and then leave the meeting to go and get the shit kicked out of them by Paul for not standing up to Tony Hoolan. So it's sort of like the staff are getting caught in the middle then, because it's desperate, really, isn't it? And then there's the quote about two alpha males marking their respective packages. But you do say, according to a number of different sources, this was deeply distracting and a different order of tension, this between the two of them. So it is a thing,
because there would ordinarily be a tension between the Department of Health and the HSE, because obviously the Department of Health is responsible for overseeing the HSE and sort of setting out what it has to do. But this was distracting. It dominated conversations and whispers and text messages. WhatsApp, effectively throughout the pandemic, was where all of the sort of I don't want to put it as a bitching session was effectively happening, where people were sort of voicing their grievances about each other. But
I just sort of felt that that's an important aspect of it, because that's still an issue now. Well, we don't know if the relationship is an issue now, but it was an issue then. And those two men are still in the positions, and we still have difficult decisions to make. So it was real insight in terms of future decisions. And also this idea of Tony Hoolan calling at Nphet meetings, asking questions that he knew the answer to about the HSE, like, what has the HSE done about capacity in ICU, knowing the HSE hadn't done anything about capacity in ICU. So deliberately showing the HSE up at Nphet meetings.
People on the HSE found that, they felt that was deliberately humiliating. That they would be singling out people and sort of just, having these laborious meetings where he wanted to do this. He wanted to make an example of, we could be in a much better position if the HSE could only hold up its end of the bargain. That's the view of people who are on Nphet, and people in the HSE at the time. They felt that they were being stitched up repeatedly.
Right.
By Tony
We'll
Hoolan.
talk a bit more about Tony Hoolan then in a second, because as you say, the whole thing when it came to the lockdown, the big Christmas lockdown, Tony Hoolan plays obviously a very big part in that. Leo asked you to go for a pint on air though, so we can't skip over that.
As soon as this happened, I remember it was one of the scariest moments of my career. It was bizarre. So this was Leo Varadkar's last speech as Taoiseach before the handover of government, and he'd done all the stuff before. He'd done all the speeches where he'd quoted like Mean Girls and Lord of the Rings and stuff like that. And he signed off. He said, no more quotes, no more speeches, or no more references. This is the end probably for me. He walked out into the courtyard in Dublin Castle, where I was standing outside with my colleague Joan McKenna, who was on camera. And we'd done our bit, and we were just like, we were told, I hear it in my earpiece, get a shot of Leo in the car driving past. It's going to be great. So we were like, perfect, this is great. He gets into the car, he pulls the door, and he sees us in the background, and he's like, I'm walking over here, and I don't know what's happening at this point, because he's walking over towards us. I'm like, we could be getting an exclusive interview. This is amazing. He just starts shouting, and he says,
"You're on air."
Yeah, we're on air. We're live broadcasting the shot. I have no idea what the audio situation is, if people at home can hear what's happening. Leo Varadkar is shouting, "Hey neighbour," and at me from across the courtyard, and he's getting progressively closer. The first time he shouts it, I'm like,
It's not really happening. This is not.
He didn't say that, did he? And then he says, "Hey, neighbour," and he gets over and he says, "When are we going for pints?" He clearly learned that I'd moved to Castleknock and I was in a house share with people, including Zara King. And it was a bit of constituency work really for him, I suppose. But he was trying to sort of press the flesh with local voters. But I was just like, I have no idea if the audio is on. I'm like, is this Leo Varadkar's last remarks as the Taoiseach is, when are we going for pints? And I just felt, I was like, this is dreadful. I don't want to be known as someone who's going for pints with Leo Varadkar. No offence to him, it's just not my, my deal.
It's tricky, but
could you imagine if Twitter, if they heard that?
Well, they've heard it now.
Chaos. Like, well, they've heard it, so it's out there. But like, imagine it was just it was just one of the bizarre things. There were so many just weird things.
That's right up there, though.
That is number
right
one, I'd say. Yeah.
Okay, so then Tony Holohan had obviously taken a break because his wife was very, very ill, and then throughout the summer, the restrictions, the trend of the disease is getting worse again, and there was a bit of dithering about what happens. Tony returns to the big bang. He's not happy with the situation. He wants level 5. And we all sort of know that all happened in this sort of big mesh of what the hell just happened there, but we didn't really know a lot of the details. You've described a lot of the details in the book. And the really interesting part for me was that Tony was told by his advisors to bypass Stephen Donnelly and go directly to the Taoiseach to let him know that this is how seriously they were thinking. We're thinking about going to level 5. But Tony was like, no, I'm going to the minister. Yeah. You know, because that's the chain of command. And that really looks to have been a crucial mistake.
That weekend is probably the most crucial in the whole relationship between Nphet and government, because it was a complete disaster from start to finish. When Tony Holohan returned, everybody on Nphet knew that we were in for a big shift in how things were going to be approached. They immediately thought, okay, we're going to go to level 5. It's like, we haven't prepared the road. We haven't told the government what we're going to do. They don't even know we're meeting at this point. They were freaking out. So you have people like Philip Nolan was on the phone at the Royal Hospital in Kilmainham, like ringing in with other people in Nphet, like, well, what the hell are we going to do? He arrives back like a storm, as Eamon Ryan describes it. And people on Nphet are like, please ring Micheál Martin. Ring Micheál Martin. Don't bother with Stephen Donnelly. Go to the Taoiseach and tell him that this is very serious and we need to make a move on this. He didn't do that, and that was something which completely changed the relationship between Nphet and government. It did damage as well relationships between Nphet and the HSE again, and Nphet just came out of that weekend completely kicked. Yeah. It was that weekend where he recommended level 5. The government was like, no.
Well, I mean, ministers were finding out about it on the news on Sunday night because a leak came from Nphet, or we don't know where the leak came from, as you say, but a leak came.
They would strongly dispute that one, yeah. But
Nphet would strongly dispute.
They would strongly dispute that, yeah.
Okay.
But it was leaked, whoever by, and it was out there. This level 5 recommendation, and people were going to bed watching the 9 o'clock news, not knowing if their kids are going to school tomorrow. Or not knowing if their shops can open tomorrow, that this was going to be an immediate recommendation. It was chaos. It was absolutely insane.
And there were relationships sort of fissured all over the place as a result. Then you had Colm Henry calling up Tony Holohan, for example. Tell us about that.
So Colm Henry is the Chief Clinical Officer in the HSE. Himself and Tony Holohan go a long way back. They've known each other for decades now. They have a huge amount of respect for each other. The weekend in question, when Nphet met and made that recommendation, we're going from level 2 to level 5. Colm Henry was actually out at the time. He was basically on a weekend in West Cork. West Cork internet, not the best. He couldn't really log in to the meeting. So he was basically in a car park, in and out of patchy reception. He didn't really sort of feel like he was able to contribute a huge amount to that meeting. After that whole thing was, the level 5 recommendation was shot down, he had a phone conversation with Tony Holohan, and he effectively told him he blew it. You've blown this. You should have gone to the Taoiseach. There were some harsh words exchanged between the two of them, and so the internal relationship of Nphet was also suffered badly at that point. If Nphet even denies that it leaked that recommendation to the media, that point actually sparked a lot more leaking out of Nphet. things changed a lot. Even on the evening when that level 5 recommendation was put out there, and Leo Varadkar actually was on the Claire Byrne show saying, these guys haven't thought this through, none of them will ever be on the PUP or put anybody in the PUP. I was getting texts from members of Nphet who were saying, this guy never set the world in light in Scrubs either. Like, you know, they were personally wounded by that attack on them. They felt it was an attack on Tony Holohan, a man who'd come back from caring for his very sick wife, on all of them who'd given up their time. A lot of them volunteered hours and hours and hours from their normal jobs to try and get us through this. So they thought that was just a complete horrible Rubicon was crossed at that point.
And this possibility that maybe if Tony had just talked to Micheál, it could have been...
And this is Micheál Martin's style. Micheál Martin is he's an old school politician. He'll ring you.
Yeah.
Do you know, he'll ring Paul Reid and he'll ring Tony Holohan and say, well, what's the latest? What can we do? How are we looking for the weekend? In the car on the way up from Dublin and back and forth to Cork. The fact that Tony Holohan didn't ring him wounded Micheál Martin personally as well. In a situation like that, you do not want to piss off effectively the Taoiseach.
Yeah.
And he did. He also caught a lot of scorn from Martin Fraser, who was the most senior civil servant in the country. The lads heard all about it then when they were at the Cabinet Subcommittee. They got an unabashed bollocking, is how it was described to me, from Martin Fraser, as well as from Pascal Donoghue as well, another person who was normally considered to having a very even temper. This was a really, really wounded situation. Micheál Martin was just sitting in that briefing and he was just like, why wasn't I told about this? If this was so serious, why was I not told? It changed everything, and it probably led us into a situation where coming into Christmas, Nphet and the government were not on the same page at all.
Yeah, and that's probably, you know, sort of the crux of the book then, really. You're sort of building up to that. Because then when Nphet come back again and say, we need level 5 for Christmas, or not, it wasn't level 5, but we need X, Y, and Z for Christmas, the government was just like not minded to listen.
Yeah.
And we know where that left us, you know.
And some people in the government would still say that there was nothing wrong with their recommendations. There are ministers now, very senior ministers at a subcommittee level, who would say, if we did what Nphet said, would we be worse off or better off? And they would make the implication that we would probably be worse off. If you put that to a number of people, including Leo Varadkar, he would say that's completely nonsensical.
Right, okay.
If you put it to people on Nphet, they're like, how are these people still standing over this? Once we saw what happened in our country, one of the most horrific and traumatic experiences that we've undergone as a country in such a long period of time.
And actually, one of the things that really struck me from the book was how you talk about the effect that had on people personally, you know, the fact that that decision was, you know, something went awfully wrong in the decision making, whoever you want to blame. And I thought it was really interesting that Philip Nolan was saying he was blaming himself, or not just himself, but Nphet, that they failed to convince the government, and he felt guilt and disappointment about their own failure, like as opposed to anger with the government for not making the decisions. You know, I just thought it was a really interesting insight.
So fascinating, the psychology
of
it,
yeah.
So basically they were all sitting, so Tony Holohan and Ronan Glynn and Philip Nolan and other people were sitting around a table. They were doing a zoom into government buildings for the Cabinet Subcommittee. They were making here's what we think you should do to let people have a safe Christmas. And basically the Zoom link went dead, they were dismissed. And they kind of sat around the table and they were like, they're not going to go our way, they're going to go a different way. And there was a feeling expressed by people there that the failure was not the government's, the failure was their own. It was their job to convince the government to do what they saw was the right thing and the safe thing, and whatever it was, they didn't land it. And there was a feeling of extraordinary guilt about that situation because of that. I think it was just fascinating. I actually put that to Leo Varadkar in this, and he was like, did not know that.
Yeah. Very
sort of sobering thought to think of.
In the middle of all this, just to go back to Paul Reid and the relationship between Paul Reid and Nphet and Tony Holohan again, you've Paul Reid constantly, you know, when Nphet is looking for backup on we need stronger restrictions, things are going the wrong way, Paul Reid's there going, we're coping, it's fine. And Nphet really unhappy about that, and seeing Paul Reid basically batting for government.
It's one of the just most fascinating dynamics I just think people may not know really about this whole 18, 19 months so far, is that the HSE and Nphet, they're not always on the same page. Very often they're completely poles apart. So Nphet goes to government looking for come on, we need some restrictions in October as well as in December. And the message from Paul Reid, from the hospitals, from the HSE is, we're okay at the moment, we're not particularly stretched. And the view from Nphet is, that's effectively a betrayal. Why is the head of the HSE effectively siding with the government's view on this?
And it wasn't just Nphet asking that, it was people in the health service, like doctors and nurses.
There were senior people in the HSE who sort of said that if they were at the same press conference, the HSE weekly briefing, as Paul Reid, and they were there, and they were asked the same question that he was, and he said, we're coping, we're all right at the moment, they would not have given the same answer, and they would probably have, if they were at the same thing at the same time as him, they'd have had to cut across him and contradict him.
Right.
Because it was a situation where all the way from, and it's interesting because we think of it as wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, and now wave 4. People in the health service in different hospitals think of it as wave 1 and wave 2. That wave 2 effectively started sometime around August, September, and the pressure did not stop all the way August, September, October, and then it kicked up a gear obviously in December and January. But it was relentless pressure. There was not a normal day of work for people in hospitals around Dublin in particular.
Just to be fair to Paul Reid, I know that you say in the book as well that he says he was just relaying what hospital managers were saying to him. That was the data he was going off. So that's
straight
what
bad is how he described it.
That's how he describes it. Sorry, we're almost there now because I know there's questions, but we have a bit of time. I have so many questions. The effect on the hospital then in Christmas, that Christmas wave, the effect on all the hospitals. And again, I think we all remember sort of sitting there watching it from the comfort of our homes, seeing what was going on. And you very vividly described the whiteboard in one of the hospitals, and they're counting the cases on the whiteboard and they're counting the deaths, and then they just stop counting the deaths.
Yeah, this is in the Department of Public Health in Midwest, in Limerick. So it's a standard office. You wouldn't look out of place any other standard office in any city in this country. They had a whiteboard. So these are public health doctors. They take basically a helicopter view of their area, the Midwest. So it's Limerick, Clare, and North Tipperary. Dr. May Mannix, there's a couple of doctors in there who are sort of specialists on infectious diseases and communicable diseases. And they look after. So if there's an outbreak in a nursing home, they'll give advice on that. If there's an outbreak in a workplace or a meat factory, they'll give advice on that. They were counting outbreaks, and it was on Christmas Eve. And it's one of the most vivid images I've come across in it. They have a whiteboard where they chart out, okay, so there's a nursing home, outbreak, how many cases and how many deaths. On Christmas Eve of 2020, they effectively were hit by a tsunami. They saw outbreak, nursing home, 20 cases, need help. Another one, and it's green and red marker, and it's just filling up in front of them. And they actually say as well, they knew that this was coming. On the day that the government announced the restrictions were going to be eased for Christmas, they felt that this was going to be a complete disaster. And they had this enormous sense of dread, and then on Christmas Eve, it played out on a big whiteboard in front of them, and it did not let up for weeks on end after that. They had extraordinarily difficult times. The nursing homes were once again completely blitzed across the Midwest, and this was horrific. And the trauma of that situation, I was actually speaking to one of the doctors there today, the trauma of that situation is made all the worse by the fact that in the nursing homes, the vaccination program was just about to start. Yeah. If some of these nursing homes hadn't been hit for a week or two later, dozens of people would still be alive today, perhaps. And it's an extraordinarily difficult thing for people to talk about still. It's a horrific thought. And this happened in a lot of nursing homes across the country as well.
Yeah. Okay, there's loads of other bits that I don't think we're going to get to. I think it's quite telling that up to this point we haven't discussed Stephen Donnelly, the health minister during the pandemic.
Let's take a sip here.
He had an awful time, didn't he, from the start? Like, he was sort of hobbled from the start, and you described fairly enough to him. He was hobbled coming into it because, you know, you can say, you know, the deputy CMO, he didn't have a CMO. Tell us why he was hobbled.
Okay, so when Stephen Donnelly took over from Simon Harris, first of all, Simon Harris was not happy about this at all. He did feel that he had a relationship built up with Micheál Martin, that he could have a chance of sticking on in the Department of Health. That did not happen. When Simon Harris left the Department of Health, he wasn't the only departure at that time. The top civil servant in the Department of Health, Jim Breslin, went and followed Simon Harris over to Simon Harris's new department. So you've lost your minister, you've lost your top civil servant, your Secretary General. Tony Holohan, of course, as well, stepped away to care for his wife. So you've lost in the Department of Health the three top figures in the Department of Health, and the minister is coming in now. It's his first time as a minister, and he has no support system. It is a really raw deal he actually got to start off.
No handover with Simon Harris?
There was no handover with Simon Harris. Simon Harris had left him a note and sort of just wishing him well. There was no response to that note. There was just a very difficult situation there for Stephen Donnelly.
So that wasn't a great start, and that wasn't any of his own fault. But then, as it went on, you describe how he was challenged, publicly challenged, all over the place. He's rubbing people up the wrong way, asking the wrong questions. You know, Paul Reid, for example, publicly challenged him because he was asking about the financials.
Basically, there was a meeting, as I understand, and it was described to me by a number of people in the HSE who were at this meeting. So Stephen Donnelly came in. This was early on in his tenure as the minister. He came in and he met a load of key people in the HSE, and he was kind of just sort of he was sort of questioning the numbers and whether or not we can cut costs and stuff like that. And Paul Reid had to pull him up. Paul Reid challenged him in front of the room full of HSE executives, basically stressing to him, you've no idea what these people have been through over this course of this pandemic to date. There's a view from people in the HSE, he just didn't have that sense of what people had been through. He lacked that little bit of that sort of that touch of, you know, understanding that minutiae of detail is what some people have described it as. That's a difficult situation. Obviously, public utterances as well were going wrong.
Yeah, Zara.
There's the trampoline situation.
We blame you, Zara.
Which we all remember. Certainly he still remembers, apparently, according to a number of key sources. There are just different utterances, and there was frustration at a government level as well with how he was starting off, but it just continued and continued and continued. And just to hear the level of frustration that's there from Nphet people, from the HSE.
Well, I'll read you one of the quotes. It's off the record, but I'm taking it as obviously verbatim. Harris could be difficult, but basically there was no substitute for experience, and Stephen Donnelly thinks he's an awful lot cleverer than he is. He doesn't understand how to use the support of his own department to get things done. He just doesn't get it. The remarkable thing about Donnelly is you can bring him something that's good news with a bow wrapped around it and say, why don't you go and announce this? And he'll either screw up the announcement or argue with you about it. Is it the right thing to do? Or be suspicious of why you're giving it to him. You know, is it ticking? Jeez.
That's really strong stuff to hear. But these are people who.
This is the sitting health minister,
yeah.
And the pandemic is not over. And then you describe another thing that I haven't marked, or I probably have, but I can't find it now, of this Zoom meeting.
Yes.
Where he asks the irrelevant question at the end, and there's this comment that Stephen Donnelly always comes in at the end with the irrelevant questions.
Yeah, and this is such I just found this so really interesting. So there's people on Nphet who would be at these subcommittee meetings, the people, all these officials, and they're all sitting around the table or on Zoom, and they'd go around. Mihall's way of directing these meetings is that each minister will have a question. So he'll start it off, he's very interested, he used to be a Minister for Health, he'll often say, and he will just let people go and have a dig at it. People on Nphet would say that the last person to ask a question was repeatedly the Health Minister in the pandemic, and they couldn't understand that. There was one instance which a lot of people have told me about where Stephen Donnelly asked some question apparently about third level colleges, and Micheál Martin apparently very visibly expressed his frustration to Stephen Donnelly. It's like, what are you asking him that for? Why are you asking these people that? You work in the same department as them. Why don't you ask them then? And it led to quite a funny moment as well. Like, the people in Nphet were watching this with their masks on because they're in a meeting room and they're looking at this, and one of them was like, will I say something? Will I put the boot in, or will I rescue him or something? And I was just like, no. He's off. Leave him go.
Okay. Did you put it to him, any of this, or did you get a chance to, or do we know what he thinks of what people seem to think of him?
I think he would probably be aware of some of this. I think in government departments there is often, perhaps not on this level, there is a culture of, it is kind of there is an airing of grievances, especially in a pandemic. People will say that there is an element of
Everyone
frustrations
gets tense and
boiling
right.
over. Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to hear him.
Yeah, well, if I get a chance to interview him anytime soon, I'll be asking him what he thinks of all this. Right, I will stop asking the questions and we'll see if we've any questions from the audience. My watch has been buzzing away, so I don't know if that's questions from WhatsApp. But does anybody in the room have a question? If you do, it's the microphone in front. We can't pass any microphone around because of COVID. But just if you raise your hand, you can come down. Have I just asked all the good questions? Is that what's going on here? Yeah. Yes. Do you want to come down yourself, please? Thank you.
Well, this is a nice setup.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions here as well.
Feels very official coming up to the front of the room. So I suppose my question, I think, like in a lot of Europe, you've seen kind of politicians and mainstream political parties exploit the pandemic for political reasons, you know, in terms of like skepticism about lockdowns, about vaccines and so on. You don't really get the sense that really happened here so much as it did elsewhere. And I was wondering if you might have any kind of insight as to why that might be the case.
That is really
Or if you'd
interesting.
agree.
Yeah, it's definitely the case that most of the major political parties in here have been very much supportive of public health. I can't think of any party which has at any point gone, end the lockdown. Do you know what I mean? There have been individual independent politicians who'd be very sceptical of it. People in Nphet would point to Michael McNamara, who of course was the chair of the COVID committee. They saw him as somebody who was undermining the message effectively. But we really haven't had that atmosphere where we have, you know, government is pro-restrictions and pro-vaccinations and there's an opposition which is undermining that. I do find it quite interesting. I think it shows that it probably does reflect the public in a way as well, where we have such a high adherence to face coverings, for example. Once they were eventually introduced, everybody took to them. I remember Eamon Ryan was slagged off when he appeared outside of Lewis one day saying everybody's going to be wearing these face masks when they're getting on the Lewis. But they did.
Wiping their glasses with them.
Yeah, exactly. Well, maybe do as I say, do not as I do is what you probably take from him there. But even in terms of vaccination, I remember the HSE was very, very concerned last year that we wouldn't get, that there was a figure of like 50 or 60% floated for vaccinations, whereas the public was well ahead of that.
Yeah.
So, like, I mean, I think there is always a case of politics will always reflect the public that is there. And when you have, for example, whatever we're at now, 93, 94% of adults fully vaccinated, maybe it's reflective of the public that's there. In other countries, there is a lower take-up, and that's where you sort of see the scepticism. Maybe there's a home for it more there.
Point. Yeah. With the political parties that we have reflect the people that we are.
Yeah,
you know,
perhaps
which is
so.
interesting.
But it's interesting. We just haven't seen that.
Yeah. Loads of questions in
Thank you.
here. Sorry, has that answered your question, or do you have any follow-up? Or are you okay?
No, I just think it's just, I think, quite an outlier, even if you compare it to maybe the UK, where there's a lot of machismo about freedom.
Yeah, even in the UK, like even within the government parties, like or even within the Conservative Party, will have really staunch anti-lockdown people. You don't really have that in Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil. There will be some people, like I remember at the start of the pandemic, you had people, Michael Ring was sort of at one cabinet meeting, or it wasn't actually a cabinet meeting, but they organised a briefing for the ministers who weren't at the big table, as it was. So if they weren't in the cabinet subcommittee, they got a chance to meet Tony Holohan anyway. And he went on a rant, effectively, is how it's been described to me, saying you're locking us all up and people are going mad in their homes and all that sort of stuff. That's probably as close as we've actually got to that sort of level of it, that we're just sort of, the government really just sort of was happy to follow the public health message,
Yeah, okay. In terms of the questions we're getting here, a couple of people are asking about nursing homes, and one person says, what are your thoughts on when or if an inquiry will occur in respect to the handling of COVID in nursing homes during the first wave? And then Judith is asking if you think nursing homes deserve and need an inquiry.
Well, they absolutely do. And I think that's something which has always been in mind when you're writing the book and you're reporting on it. I think like the government has said that they have committed to that. I think that there was an appetite that the wheels would be in motion by now. The answer that it appears to be coming from government on why that's not happening is that we're still in a situation, and that pulling up public health people or the HSE at a time when they're all still dealing with the pandemic wouldn't be constructive.
Okay.
That's their justification. I don't know.
Will we ever have spare public health staff, in this country, you'd wonder? Like they've managed to do the inquiry in Brazil already.
Yeah.
You know?
The UK has already published its parliamentary inquiry into it. There is a question, it's actually quite interesting. Like if you ask people in Nphet and the Department of Health and in the HSE about what do they think about an inquiry into all of this, some of them will point to things like the Oireachtas committees and say, that's not going to help things. They see that as a witch hunt, that they have, as they would see it, a number of TDs who are out to, I'm going to get Tony Houlihan today, or I'm going to get Ronan Glynn, or I'm going to get Paul Reid.
Okay.
Their view is that there's grandstanding, that there'll be shouted questions, and they'll get a clip on the news. Whereas, as opposed to finding fact, I know Micheál Martin's view on it as well. I asked him about this for the book as well. Is that they don't want a situation where, you know, you're sort of finding fact against individual civil servants, for example. That he feels like, well, people were in an unprecedented situation. Nobody did anything willfully wrong. Are you going to have people fill those positions in the future, key civil service roles, being the chief medical officer, the deputy chief medical officer, etc., if they're going to get hung out to dry at the end of the pandemic? Yeah. I don't know about that justification.
And you can understand all those points. I suppose the thing is you have willful doing something wrong, and I don't think anybody suspects that might have happened, but there could have been an awful lot of incompetence, you know, that we need to look at.
Yeah.
And also, obviously, just the basic structures that were in place, the communication channels, you know, the sort of emergency plans that were or weren't there, like all of that. How do we learn if we don't look back? And actually, sorry, we have more questions here, but does anybody else have a question here before I move on to the questions here? Yes, yeah, go on ahead.
I'm going to say it's brave, actually, because they have to walk up.
Like
it's much easier when the mic comes to you. It feels like I'm in a public proposal or something.
If you want, you know, we can.
Firstly, congratulations.
Or maybe we need tickets for that, sorry.
Congratulations on the book, Richard. I really
so
enjoyed
much.
your journalism throughout this whole 18 months, whatever it is now, and indeed the wider Virgin Media team. I think you're brilliant. Just, I suppose, we've all been through this thing together and we've all kind of gone through our own personal things with it. I suppose, what have you learned about yourself through this whole journey, and what kind of brings you into work every day, I suppose?
Good question.
Great question.
Thank you for that. Yeah, because this is like, it is one thing you sort of think about, because there's nobody in this country who hasn't had their life completely flipped upside down by all of this. I had, in my own situation, obviously I was separated from my partner Louise, who's here. She's living in West Cork. I was up here in Dublin. My family as well, my mum, who I think is here somewhere. I don't know where she is. She's at the back. Good to see her. I haven't seen, this is why I haven't seen much of her throughout the whole thing. Both herself and my brother, who's watching at home, they're both quite vulnerable to COVID. So basically it wasn't a risk. So I was basically separated from them. I was separated from Louise. That was really difficult. At times you kind of just have to block it out. You have to focus on, well, I'm in this situation, but so many other people are in this situation. There's healthcare workers who have seen their family, like they've moved out and they've moved into hotels for the duration of what they're doing. But it's not easy. It's not easy at all to do any of this. I suppose technology plays a role. You sort of have people around you and friends who are your housemates who you sort of lean on in these situations, but
leaves a mark.
It just leaves a mark. Yeah, it is. It's really difficult. Was there a second? Sorry, there was a second part to that question as well, was there? Oh, you can have a bad day. Yeah.
Oh yes, you can.
Publicly have bad days. People dancing in the background. You can have all sorts of things happen. Yeah, I think it was important. I just felt, and I think I would say for a lot of journalists out there, you kind of have to. It's important that people understand what's happening and what's changing in their lives, or what are the reasons, what are the restrictions, because some of the government communication in particular was complete. It was garbage at times. It was complete garbage. It was muck. You even see the situation now with nightclub guidelines, and they tie themselves up in knots with these announcements, and they go back on them and they change it, and they're briefing, oh, it's going to be, you can get your ticket for your nightclub 10 minutes beforehand, while they're still at the same time telling the nightclubs and the vintners, nah, it's going to be 24 hours, mate. Like, it's just the communications end of things for the government has been quite difficult at times. So to be able to break things down and help people to understand it.
Ask Richard Chambers on Twitter.
I mean, yeah, like, I mean, but like that, there's an element of that which is really good, is that there's an approach, but people see us as approachable. Yeah. That people will say, okay, well, can you explain this for us in a way that makes sense? Obviously,
and you could,
yeah.
which is great. It's a huge power to have, really, to be able to help people like that. Because people were genuine.
Yeah.
I know it's become a bit of a thing on Twitter, but there's a lot of people genuinely looking for help and are confused and looking for.
Yeah, that's important. Like, I mean, if people are genuinely confused and whatever, but that's really important. Like,
okay.
Yeah.
We better wrap up very quickly. Does anyone have a burning question? Oh God, we have a burning question.
Just a question on leadership. So, like, say comparing like the States to like the UK or the US, like vaccination rates are really high here. There's a high level of compliance generally with Irish people, but like as we kind of heard tonight, and many of us already know, like the leadership has at sometimes been wanting. Like, do you see any explanation for that, or why do you think like in general Ireland has had some measures of success despite the at times kind of chaotic leadership?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've no idea if I have the answer to it. Like, why did people think, or maybe it was because we just had this experience of it, maybe we have the sense of community, maybe it's something like that, I don't know, but it's been one of the most amazing things. It's actually, I wanted to make the point before we finished. I was actually on the way in here, I was trying to remember, when was the last time I was in DCU? And it was actually for the vaccine clinics over in the Helix. And I've completely dissociated the place from it because I just thought it was such a different time. And I remember the last time I was here, there were loads of people, loads of families, and I think it was the over 70s were getting vaccinated at that time. And it was second doses.
That was a good time, wasn't it?
And there was just people, and they were just stepping out, and they were seeing people who might have lived only like 2 streets away, and they hadn't seen them for a year. Do you know what I mean? And it was actually Dr. Matthew O'Fuelon, I think I saw was here. He was organising the GP-led clinic on it. Extraordinary work which was done on this campus to keep people safe around Dublin. There's actually a funny story about that as well. Matthew told me over the course of the book, he was organising this whole vaccine clinic here, but when they sort of said, we need a place in Dublin for GPs to come together and give the vaccines to their patients. Okay, we could go to DCU. And they're like, where's that? That's over in the north side. And the way he says it is that there's a number of GPs from the south side who basically had to pull out of the scheme because their patients wouldn't go north side.
Stop.
He sold it to them as being basically, well, there's 2 places in Dublin which on the north side which everybody's been to, and that's IKEA and the airport, and it's kind of near to both of them, so it's kind of like just going to the airport. So it must have worked because there's a lot of people here, and it was amazing. It was amazing to see. It was actually one of the nicer days of it is when you're seeing people just come out of basically, it's like, because we called it cocooning. People were basically just blossoming out of their cocoons again. Yeah. It was amazing to see laughter again.
And they could fly.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, final question then, and we'll give it to Judith as well. I don't know if that's a different Judith or the same one, but she's saying, in the last line of the book, you say, Ireland must begin to remember. And she's wondering, do you have any suggestions to commemorate the people that we've lost?
I think I would always defer to, I think I know who that is. Judith Butler is one person who I was speaking to over the course of the book, and her mother was one of the people who died in January, having basically, it was around the time of the vaccines, so this was a huge relief to her family. Her family are enormously strong people to have come through all of this. They lost their mum over the course of this. I have no idea, but I think that the family should be consulted in some way. Like over the course of Ireland, on the island of Ireland, more than 8,000 people have died. That is a huge some amount of people. If you look at places like Belmullet, for example, in County Mayo, there's multiple people in a very tiny area who are gone. Some suggestions have been, like I remember there was one small sort of service out in the Memorial Gardens in Island Bridge, where a load of ICU doctors cycled up from across the country, and they all left white roses out for family members, one for each person who died, so families can come along and take a rose away. I thought that was absolutely lovely. I think it's important that we do start the process on that.
Yeah.
I think that there is a danger that we go too far down the line, that we end the pandemic and people naturally will want to say, I do not want to think about that again. But we can't do that. We've seen pandemics start. There's been 3 novel coronaviruses in the last 15 years between SARS, MERS, and now COVID-19. There's going to be more pandemics in the future. We need to learn the lessons of it. And we can't have it like the last pandemic we had in this country in 1918, which was completely just forgotten about. It's really important. So many families, so many communities, so many people have been affected by this and have lost people they care about, and I think it's really important that we just do start that process. I know that the Taoiseach had sort of said that we'd start to do that in the new year, but I think that the conversation, there's never too soon to start that.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I think we will leave it there for this evening. So thank you so much, Richard,
Thank
for
you so
joining
much,
us
Sarah.
this evening.
I
And you
really
should all
appreciate
read it. It's amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, there was a pause because of the live stream. My name is Julianne. I'm Festival Director, Dublin Book Festival. A huge thank you to Richard and Sarah for this evening. It was a really insightful, entertaining conversation and a brilliant way to start. It's the festival's first live event in 2 years and our first time ever live streaming. So a huge thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to DCU for hosting us this evening and for all of the team, especially the alumni team who got behind the event and answered all of our questions and took care of us today. They very kindly put on a reception outside, so hopefully there'll be tea and coffee and cake still left over if the students haven't dived in and eaten it all, but we'll see. Richard will be signing his book. I know many of you have already bought it, so he'll be signing the book upstairs, so we'll take him away from the stage. Dublin Book Festival has lots more events going on, 8th to the 15th of November. Grab a programme or check out our website. Thank you to everyone who came out tonight. It's been a really special evening for the Dublin Book Festival team and to everyone who's been watching at home. So do join us again for the rest of our events. Thank you.